As Dr. Ebeling told you, my credentials for talking about capital theory result from a sort of a set of fortuitous circumstances in that I found myself in a place and time associated with an authority in capital theory that sort of determined where I would go for the rest of my life. Being in South Africa, stumbling into economics and finding myself with a teacher who happened to be an authority on capital theory and Austrian capital theory to boot, sort of set the tone for the next, for the rest of my life, basically. So who knows how different it might otherwise have been. So I really found myself immersed in the subject as a keen undergraduate, sort of came of age in economics into capital theory, and then put it on hold for some years while I pursued my PhD. And then when I came back to Austrian economics, it was a logical thing that I should return to the subject. I set myself the task, as I like to say, of coming back to the subject and trying finally to understand what I had been, what Professor Lachman had been trying to teach me. And I hope in completing that book project that Dr. Ebeling referred to, I may finally have got some ways towards doing that. But capital theory is a difficult subject, one way or another. It needn't be as difficult as it sometimes appears, but because of the obscurities and ambiguities sometimes that surround it, it is frequently ignored, and that's a pity, as I'll try and suggest to you in the two lectures that I have. Just some housekeeping matters. I'm going to talk about the Austrian theory of capital and interest, and here are some links, I guess, virtual and just information-wise. You can feel free to email me anytime you want. I don't know if you can see the small print at the back there. You can? Okay. plewin@utdallas.edu, and you can find my website here at www.utdallas.edu. That sign is called a tilde, P. Lewin. And if you add a fee onto that, I have set up a little site there where you can get these, where you can download or stream these PowerPoint presentations that I'm going to do now, the one now and the one after Dr. Ebeling's next talk. I see also that you have a reading list that Dr. Ebeling put together, so I wasn't aware you had that before, and I imagine that some of you also know about the resources at the Mises Institute, but I thought I'd put a link on the website. If you want to go to it, you can link to a reading list that has some material that will be relevant to what I'm talking about today. In addition, I have a paper that's coming out in the Review of Austrian Economics next issue, or maybe the one after that, on my website. You can, I think it's in PDF form, so you can download it if you're just in case you're interested in some of the material. Okay, so let us begin. I'll begin with a little bit of background and a preview of what I'm going to talk about. So we may as well start with a basic question. What is capital and what is capital theory? It seems like an impertinent question. You know, after all, if we don't know what we're talking about, what are we doing here? But the truth of the matter is that that word capital and the subject matter is sometimes presents difficulties in boundaries and limits and content. So it often depends on who you ask as to what you mean by capital theory. If you pick at random a mainstream economist or mainstream economic student and ask them what they mean by capital, they'll probably tell you something to do with financial markets. Capital, the word is often used in terms of when unqualified, meaning financial capital. And that's not the sense in which we're going to talk about it today. We're going to talk about the creation of value over time. It has to do, it's all about value and time. So we're going to talk about how it is you know that modern economies, or economies where you have specialized production, achieves what it achieves. In order to do that, you have to set up a productive structure, and in adding value, that value is a whole lot of what we think about when we talk about capital. I suppose we could make a distinction between real value and financial value, but capital, when we use the word capital in this context, unqualified, we mean real capital. Physical things, buildings, or as Professor Lachman would put it, beer barrels and hotel room furniture. Those things that are out there that, when used properly, put together and as part of a plan for producing value, if successful, do so. And of course, most recently, in recent years, we've realized that using that term, that concept consistently, you have to include the human capital, the training that gets embodied in individuals, and without which you could not, together with other pieces of the puzzle, put together the ingredients to achieve the plans that you have made. But that's a slightly more complicated issue that we won't really have much time to go into. So it's all about value and time. I'm going to begin in a moment my discussion with Adam Smith. I'm going to do a little bit, if you'll forgive me, if you'll indulge me, a little bit of an overview of sort of capital concepts, how it started, or not really started, but I'm going to pick it up at some point with Adam Smith. And I'm going to suggest to you that he saw clearly the connection between time-consuming production processes and increased productivity that came from judiciously applied division of labor. He had a what we will later on call a fairly early Mengerian view of capital. We're going to look at David Ricardo, who really shifted the interest and turned onto what appears to us from some points of view a disastrous detour, or at least he had a different point of view. We're going to look at Karl Menger briefly and his distinction between the goods of higher and lower orders. We're going to note that production has a time structure that's crucial for our understanding of capital. And we're going to look at Blum-Barweg, who really wrote the book, 3 volumes, on Austrian capital theory, in introducing the idea of roundabout production, or at least the terminology roundabout production, and also look very briefly, as time permits, at the phenomenon of interest, the concept of interest. We all know what it is, or think we know what it is, but when you unpack it, deconstruct it a little bit, you find that there are rather intriguing issues associated with it. And then we'll look at what I've called the moderns. The Mises and Hayek approached capital theory in the beginning because they wanted to, there was this question of the business cycle, there was the question of explaining economic fluctuations, and capital theory, not to mention Austrian capital theory, had been shunted aside in the interests of simplicity, hopefully leading to insight, but the the simplicity achieved really led to obscure rather than to reveal, and there was a perceived need to go into capital theory for that purpose. I'm just going to briefly mention some of that because I'll go into it in much more detail in the second lecture that I have with you. And the names here are Lachman and of course Kerzner. Roger Garrison, I think no one has done more than he has in the modern literature to really look very closely at the application of Austrian capital theory for modern macroeconomics. And I'll be talking more about his work later on. My colleague Steve Horwitz, whom I think was here earlier, he also has a book on monetary disequilibrium theory that uses capital theory. Mark Skousen has a book out on the structure of capital. Bob Murphy, I think some of you know him, has done some really interesting work on interest theory, and there are others, of course, and my name is they're listed along there just for completeness. So I will end after looking a little bit at all those things with a word or two about the economics of organization, because I'm not sure that there's a whole lot more that can be said about Austrian capital theory when you come down to it. It's one of those things that's going to come up in every generation, I suppose, depending upon how people's interests fluctuate over time. But I found a very important application of the notion of the structure of production in modern concerns about the economics of organization in general. The question of how do you organize productive activity. We talk a lot about markets. We don't talk a whole lot about structures within organizations like firms or families or non-profit organizations and so on. So I am interested in that area and have devoted some recent research to doing that with a co-author and some of it by myself, and I may just mention some of that to you. Now, as I go through some of this, if you have any questions, feel free to raise them. If I feel like the questions are going to detain us, or that you are anticipating something that I will get to, then I'll tell you. But very often I find questions help focus the discussion. So if there's anything that's unclear, or you want to raise a point, then please feel free to do so. I have this slide that I bring up that I will present again in the next lecture. Can you all see this? Is it okay? Well, it looks very faint from here. This is a chart, a very rough chart of what I've called the schools of economic thought. It's very, as I say, very rough. And it's meant just to give an outline. I assume most of you, probably even coming in here, but certainly by now, since you've had 2 days worth of exposure of the sort of laying out the history of the Austrian school, and probably in relation to all the other schools, that you're pretty much familiar with what's on here. But just as a frame of reference, I put it up here. I use it for my students all the time anyway. So I start things with the classical economists, not suggesting that there wasn't economics before them. Well, of course there was economics before Adam Smith, but excuse me, but you have to start somewhere. And so I start there with the classical economists, Adam Smith, David Hume, one of my favorites, David Ricardo, James Mill, John Stuart Mill, and others. And I traced the classical economists coming down through the neoclassical revolution, which is not relevant to us really too much today, to the neoclassicals, sort of macro neoclassicals, Alfred Marshall and Irving Fisher. Pigou, the last individual at Cambridge before Keynes, unfortunately situated, because he was the guy that Keynes decided to make the straw man for the tearing down of classical economics. Pigou would have been famous for something else if Keynes had not come after him. His bad luck. In any event, Keynes is the professor of economics at Cambridge, and he's consciously and very carefully and very successfully mounts the Keynesian revolution, and we'll talk more about that when I see you again. In the meantime, sort of ignoring the Keynesian revolution, or trying hard to ignore the Keynesian revolution, is the Chicago school. Drawing directly from classical economics in a modern idiom, it invents monetarism with Milton Friedman and all the offshoots of that, the rational expectations theories and some others, which would be down here, which we don't really go into. And what I really want to show here is that the Austrian school derives directly from Adam Smith, and does not, Menger was not really looking at all at David Ricardo, and we'll talk more about that. So this just is a kind of something to keep in mind as to how everything fits in. So let's just talk a little bit about Adam Smith, and let's talk about how he saw capital. He said, I just selected a quote here that I think encapsulates. Adam Smith had a tremendous power, it seems to me, in a very short space of time, to encapsulate a lot of profound ideas in a way that did not seem complicated when you read it. However, if you were to try and write it the way he did, you'll find it impossible. Even after 200 plus years, he reads very clearly. At least that's the way I see it. You can decide. He says the annual produce of the land and labor of any nation can be increased in its value by no other means but by increasing either the number of its productive laborers, so you increase labor input, or the productive power of those laborers, you give them more skills, who had before been employed. The number of productive laborers, it is evident, can never be much increased but in consequence of an increase in capital, so he uses that word, or of the funds destined for maintaining them. The productive powers of the same number of laborers cannot be increased but in consequence either of some addition and improvement to those machines and instruments which facilitate and abridge labor, so that's technological change, technological improvement, or of a more proper division and distribution of employment. Here he's talking about economic organization. In either case, the additional capital is almost always required. It is by means of an additional capital only that an undertaker of any work can either provide his workmen with better machinery or make a more proper distribution of employment amongst them. So this is, at least seems to me, a good starting point for the idea of capital. In the classical economists, it is seen as a kind of a fund for feeding people while you're getting things better. So Adam Smith, you know, his basic idea is that some nations are wealthier than others by virtue of not so much of the fact that they have better resources, but by virtue of the fact that they have better social institutions that organize those resources. And those social institutions most particularly are the ones that allow for a division of labor, what he calls a proper division of labor. And the larger the market, as the division of labor allows for larger markets allow for greater division of labor. There's a positive dynamic, and that's how nations grow. So this notion of division of labor, you know, his pin factory, where you divide up labor into so many different stages, and from that you get tremendous increases in production. And as a result, that division, that specialization has to be done by somebody. Somebody has to, not all of it all at once, but piecemeal, people have to make decisions. And in doing so, they have to have plans, and those plans can only be implemented over time. So if you're going to, build a more productive machinery, or you're going to organize products in a more roundabout way, a more indirect way, you're going to have to feed people in the meantime while you're doing that before the plans come to fruition. And that the classical economists saw as a kind of a subsistence fund. You keep people alive while you're laying in the capital, or while you're accumulating the capital. And that's what he's referring to here. But there's a lot more, if I commend this to your examination at your leisure. There's a lot more in this paragraph where you see that he's really talking about so many things. He's talking about you can increase product if you increase the number of workers, or if you increase their productivity, or if you increase the amount of the productive things they work with, or if you increase the productivity of the things that they work with. But one thing is for sure: if you want to increase value, you want to create value, then certain things are necessary. You have to save. You have to have this fund in order to achieve economic growth. You have to put aside from consumption some stuff. And the earning of profit is consequent not simply upon the accumulation of capital, but significantly also upon the fruits of the division of labor, as he points out. In other words, you don't just accumulating capital will give you something, but there's more to it than that. In modern terms, we could say capital accumulation, technical progress, and economic organization are all tied together. So the availability of capital, as I understand it now, is necessary, though apparently not sufficient, for the adoption of new and more productive methods of production. I want you to think about the connection between accumulation in a situation in which no technological change is happening, and a situation in which capital accumulation is connected to technical change. If you think about it in economic growth models, so standard economic growth models, we separate these things out, and mostly we just run those models without technical change. It was at least very clear in Adam Smith. And this is related to this next point. There's a type of diminishing returns, he says. He says there is a type of diminishing returns, although this is clearly not in the form of a declining rate of return to investment in a given mode of production. What we're really referring to here is knowledge. In other words, when people know how to do things a particular way, that's what we mean by mode of production. Technical change really means you give people the knowledge to do things differently. We learn. We learn as individuals how to do things differently, and therefore as a society and economy. So in a given mode of production, you will have diminishing returns as you accumulate more capital. You know, if you have any fixed factors, then the returns will diminish, diminishing marginal productivity. But that's not what he's referring to. He's rather referring to the eventual possible exhaustion of investment opportunities for extending the division of labor. That is for the discovery and introduction of new and improved production methods. There's even a hint of entrepreneurship in here. You had a lecture from Professor Kersner, right? And I'm not sure if he had I'm sure he had an opportunity to talk about entrepreneurship. So there's a connection here too. David Ricardo, about 30 years after Smith, is writing in a different place, a different world. He has different concerns. He's in a world in which he's worried about the pressures of population, courtesy of Dr. Malthus, who says that the world is going to run out of resources. Does that sound familiar? Because the population is growing according to geometric progression, and the world's resources are not. And the one juxtaposed with the other is going to cause a big gap. Land is fixed. Wages are fixed because of this population growing up to the point of subsistence. So people produce just enough of themselves to earn the minimum of subsistence. And so this thing that he called rent, the Ricardian theory of rent, keeps rising. Rent is what he understood to be the earnings from landowners. People own land and they rent it out. And if the population is growing, there's tremendous pressure, continual pressure for the uses of those land. You extend production to the less and less productive margins, and the intramarginal pieces of land earn more and more. So rent keeps rising, profits keep falling because the business community keeps on investing. There's competition between them. They drive down the rate of profit to its competitive level, or to the point of the cost of capital, if you like it, which is no profit. We would say in neoclassical economics, no normal profit, until the stationary state is reached. So Ricardo's point of view is rather pessimistic. He's kind of worried about the laws of distribution is his focus. The laws of distribution between these categories that he invented, or that he fleshed out, capital, labor, and land, is what, that's what you learn when you learn economics about the factors of production. And these things capital earns profit, something we'll talk about, labor earns wages, and land earns rent. This is the Ricardian way of thinking about it that comes into neoclassical economics and the microeconomics that we all learn. The point is, to calculate a rate of profit, you need to measure capital. He has this business class that these are the people that are investing the capital, and they're earning a rate of profit. From the perspective of a single business, maybe not so complicated, because you can just do it in value terms. You do the books and you find out at the end of the day whether you've earned a profit or not. You project a profit in terms of looking forward, in terms of a budget. And after the fact, you calculate to see whether you've earned a profit in terms of the receipts and expenditures. But if you want to talk about the rate of profit for the economy as a whole, it's a little more difficult, even for an individual organization, because you have to try and somehow evaluate those pieces of equipment and physical things that are employed in the production plan that are durable over time, that last over time. In Adam Smith's world, he wrote as if there was like a 1-year cycle. So you could just, what he called it, a corn economy. You could just figure out, you put a certain amount of corn aside, you don't consume it for next year's harvest, and as a result the total yield from the harvest grows, so you can calculate your rate of profit in terms of corn over corn. But what if you have a something productive like corn, but something that's durable, that lasts over time? How do you know how much of it is used up in any period? What is its value at the end of the year as compared to the beginning of the year? And that's really, you begin with those kinds of questions to see some of the more tricky problems in capital theory, the questions of value and how do you value these things. So Adam Smith was working in a different world, a world of durable capital equipment. And what he does really is he extends Adam Smith's metaphor by assuming that all capital, including durable capital, is really circulating capital, like Adam Smith's corn. It's circulating, but it's just circulating a little more slowly, which is an intuitive idea where we use sort of still today in the notion that if you have a machine, a piece of capital equipment that you use during the year, we put aside a certain amount for depreciation or maintenance, right? The idea is that somehow you're using some of that up in the same way as you would be extracting from a stock of raw materials or corn. But there are inescapable and very difficult elements of judgment in that you pick two people at random and you ask them how much of this machine has been used up. They're going to give you different answers. It's not just calculating how much corn you have at the end of the year compared to how much you had at the beginning of the year. So he wrestles with this, but the main point here is that in order to get a rate of profit, he needs to measure capital. And he comes up with this construct that has come down to us that is known as the labor theory of value. He draws the implication that value can be measured by the value of the input. The value of any item can be measured by the value of the things that went into producing it. A cost of production theory of value. Or, in this particular case, by the value of the labor, the amount of labor that went into it. The labor theory of value, which is a very powerful and also very influential and, in some sense, disastrous idea. But it has a lot of appeal, that somehow if you want to know why something's worth more than something else, you can say, well, it took twice as much labor to produce it, that's why it's worth twice as much. So, as I say, he was in a world where there was a lot more industrialization. There was, you introduced this term heterogeneity of capital, the idea being that that capital is composed of so many different items that are part of this capital structure that it becomes very difficult to sort of reduce it down to a single total or category that can simply be added up. As I say, I got ahead of myself. All capital is circulating, and he introduced this the practice that the economy can be assumed to be in equilibrium at any time. You see, this notion of equilibrium is somewhat implied in Adam Smith, insofar as he talks about the price tending towards its natural price, the cost of production. But it's in Ricardo that we really get this idea of an economy driven by laws of distribution towards a long-term equilibrium, stationary state, and then a jump from that into the assumption that we're always in some kind of equilibrium, this equilibrium always theorizing. This idea in this context, most importantly, that the rate of profit is always the same for everybody everywhere. Everybody's earning the competitive rate of profit. How could that be if we're in equilibrium? And later on we'll see that the assumption of assuming equilibrium everywhere allows one to reduce values to their equilibrium values, and it solves the value ambiguity problem, solves the evaluation problem. But if you don't have equilibrium everywhere, you're in a disequilibrium world in which some people put different valuations on the same things, you cannot solve the problem in that way. So with Ricardo, we have a situation in which capital flows always ensure a uniform rate of profit. If you can earn more by investing in project A than in project B, everybody knows that, so they take funds out of project B, invested in project A, and since that's that's manifest for everybody to see, we would not for very long see any discrepancy between rates of profit in any two projects. That's what his perspective implies. Of course, we would want to ask the question, first of all, how do you know what you can earn in Project A versus Project B? And who knows it? And when do they know it? And how long does it take to get the funds from the one to the other? And while that's happening, are things changing? There's a kind of a path dependence problem, as we would say today. So those are questions ignored by Ricardo and ignored by those who write and who wrote in his legacy. What did we take from Ricardo in the modern world? Well, we really focused on quantification. As you know, in modern economics, there's this tremendous focus on quantification, not so much in practice, but in principle, in the formal models that we write. Ricardo wanted to be able to quantify because he wanted to be able to discern the laws of distribution. So he shifts to a more mechanical way of looking at things, laws of distribution that drive society. He has a cost of production valuation, as I've said. And as this cost of valuation, I didn't say much about it a moment ago, cost of production, it is really a reflection of what we might call a materialist fallacy. It was partially banished by the neoclassical revolution. So this idea that somehow value is determined by the value of the inputs, the value of any output is determined by the value of the inputs, is banished when we get to the neoclassical revolution, when we get to the discovery of marginal utility. Because at that point, Carl Menger and Jevons and Walras clearly understand that the value of anything is determined by the valuation put on it by the final user, by whoever's prepared to pay for it. So the value of the inputs is determined by the value of the outputs, not the other way around. What you earn is determined by what somebody's prepared to pay for what you produce. The value of what you produce is not determined by your value. Value is anchored in subjective perceptions, not in the intrinsic worth of something that is used to produce something else. And the neoclassical economists in 1871 onwards recognized this. And it was from that point on that we get the invention of the marginal analysis, of marginal utility, and the production at the margin, value at the margin, maximizing profits at marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and so on and so forth. But so they banish the idea of the labor theory of value. They say, well, Ricardo was wrong. With no way to know what labor is worth in the absence of any market for its output. Not only that, different units of labor are worth different amounts, and so on. So they banish the labor theory of value, but they don't thereby admit that it's difficult or impossible to evaluate certain things by virtue of different perceptions of them. Rather, they introduce a new mechanism, and that is the idea of general equilibrium. That if you have general equilibrium, well, then everybody's perceptions are brought into coordination. Everybody has the same perception, so we don't have any value ambiguity. And that's what we really inherit from Ricardo. I'm going to have to move a little bit faster. Carl Menger, who was one of the founders of marginal utility, discoverers of marginal utility, although in a very distinctive way, and is different, I'm sure you've been told, from his other co-discoverers. We're interested in his views on capital, which owe much to Adam Smith and really nothing to Ricardo. He argued that there is a time structure to the production process, and he distinguished between what we call goods of lower order and goods of higher order. The earlier one intervenes in nature's processes, the more productive one can be, is what he argues. So the goods of lower order, the lowest order, are consumption goods, and then sometimes this terminology is a little confusing, but that's how you have to understand it. The lowest order is consumption, and then the higher they are, the more removed they are from consumption. And his idea, he says very clearly in a few pages in the Principles of Economics, that basically that's how we progress. We inherit fruits from nature, we inherit resources, and then we go out there and we intervene. And the earlier we intervene, if you understand it as a time structure, sort of time sequence, if we start planning earlier, the earlier we start, the more scope we have for affecting the final product, and the more time we have for experimenting, I guess, the more time we have to figure things out. And that's an important idea that's picked up later on, of course, by Bombarvek. He says here, I quote, "By making progress in the employment of goods of higher orders for the satisfaction of their needs, economizing men can most assuredly increase the consumption goods available to them accordingly, but only on condition that they lengthen the periods of time over which their activity is to be extended," I guess that's a typo, "in the same degree that they progress to goods of higher order." So in other words, production is the result of human planning. It's not a whole lot of that in Ricardo. It is there in Adam Smith. There can be errors, and the market tends to correct such errors, but there's no continual equilibrium. There is a continual groping of the structure of production. It's a structure rather than you can just add it up and say it's that number. It's more like a structure of things, more like a list rather than a total. I'll talk a little bit about that. There's a continual groping of the structure of production towards the changing structure of consumption. So let's see, what do we learn from Menger? If we adopt his perspective, we cannot lose sight of the variety of goods and services and individual activities and choices. There's no suggestion of a uniform rate of profit at any point in time. Yet there is an inescapable order in the variety provided by our understanding of the purposes of individuals. So we have variety, we have heterogeneity, we have diversity, but it's not chaos. It's a structure in the sense that we can relate the components one to the other. And what's the glue? The glue is our understanding, our intersubjective understanding of what they are used for. What's the plan? What do they do? The meaning, the purpose, the function. He says, the process of transforming goods of higher order into goods of lower order must always be planned and conducted with some economic purpose in view by an economizing individual. Capital and the continuous conscious organization of production are inextricably linked in Adam Smith and in Carl Menger. Eugen von Bombarvek is the most visible and well-known Austrian economist, in some senses the master of Austrian capital theory. He writes 3 volumes over many years and engages many eminent scholars who debated with him. His vision comes from Menger. Instead of seeing it as a goods of lower order and goods of higher order, sort of goods of higher order come down to us, goods of low order, he has a metaphor of goods of concentric circles. Sort of the inner circles is where it culminates, and the further out you go, the more removed the production processes are from their final product. He says, wisely chosen, and he uses this term translated, roundabout methods of production are more productive, I put in scare quotes because we'll talk a little bit about that, and say they yield a greater volume of consumption goods. So the Bombarvek 3 volumes here, I'll summarize 3 volumes in a couple of quotations for you. Get your value for your money. There are 2 concomitants of the adoption of the capitalist methods of production, he says. One is advantageous, the other is disadvantageous. With an equal expenditure of the 2 originary mean, I guess, early, original, productive forces, labor and valuable forces of nature, labor and land, we would say maybe, it is possible by well-chosen roundabout capitalist methods to produce more or better goods than would have been possible by the direct non-capitalist method. It is a truism well corroborated by empirical evidence. So he's putting out an empirical proposition that we progress, a little bit like Adam Smith, we progress in the world by adopting well-chosen, that's not all productive methods that are longer are going to be more productive. But given a market economy where, badly chosen, ill-chosen productive processes are punished, we would expect them to be selected out. And if we look around, we will see that the economies that do best are those that are most highly specialized. In other words, have more roundabout methods of production. One thing that can be stated with a reasonable degree of certainty, he says, is the proposition that as a general rule, a wisely selected extension of the roundabout way of production does result in an increase in the magnitude of the product. It can be confidently maintained that there is no area of production which could not materially increase its product over the result obtained by its present method. This is a very strong statement, I think you would agree. But a sacrifice is involved, he says. The disadvantage which attends the capitalist method of production consists in a sacrifice of time and value. Capitalist roundaboutness is productive but time consuming. It yields better consumption goods, but not until a later time. All consumption goods which man produces come into existence through the cooperation of human powers with the forces of nature, which are in part of economic character, in part free natural powers. Man can produce the consumption goods he desires through those elemental productive powers. He does so either directly or indirectly through the agency of intermediate products which are called capital goods. So a distinction between capital and capital goods. The indirect method entails a sacrifice of time, but gains the advantage of an increase in the quantity of the product. Successive prolongations of the roundabout method of production yield further quantitative increases, though in diminishing proportions. As a question arises, is he talking about diminishing returns under a given state of knowledge, under a given mode of production, or is he talking about diminishing returns, echoing Adam Smith, in the sense that the scope for finding new discoveries, introducing new technologies, is also likely to be limited? That's something that's not altogether clear in Bohm-Barweg. So the question I want to pose about him, in addition to the one that I just did, is Bohm-Barweg talking about a structural approach to capital or a quantitative approach to capital? That is to say, is he drawing from Menger or is he drawing from Ricardo? Clearly he believes in a structure, right? He was a student of Menger's. He's an Austrian economist in the full sense. So the question might seem impertinent. He does believe in a structure. Nation's capital is a sum of heterogeneous, he says, concrete capital goods. To aggregate them, one needs a common denominator. This common denominator cannot be found in the number of capital goods. You cannot just add them up like Adam Smith could add up bushels of corn. Nor their length or width or volume, weight, or any other physical unit of measure. The only measuring rod that does not lead to contradictions is the value of these capital goods. Okay? Nevertheless, he provides a formal quantitative treatment. There's a sort of an inconsistency, or at least a tension. He says it is more important as well as correct to consider the average time interval occurring between each expenditure of originary productive forces and the final completion of the ultimate consumption good. A production method evinces a higher or lower degree of capitalist character according to whether, on the average, there is a longer or shorter period of waiting for the remuneration of the expenditure of the original productive force of labor. So, say a few words about this. If you read Bohm-Barweg, you see that he's writing at a time when there's a lot of discussion on his topic, and he's got a lot of people picking at him, if you like. There's a lot of wrestling with the ideas of capital and what it should be, and he goes around and around on this question of, well, how do you know how much capital is involved? This question of quantification. And he decides that it's not a question of the labor theory. It's not a question of how much labor goes into it, but it is a question of how much time, in a sense, how much time is involved in the production process. If you could get a handle on that, you could get a handle on how large is capital. You could reduce it to what he called the average period of production, how much time is involved. And he calculates the thing, and it looks like that in modern form, which is a pretty quantitative way of going about it. It's not a complicated formula. It says that the T, which is the average period of production, is going to be a weighted sum of the labor time going into it. So this is a straight sum of the labor L labor time, I guess. If you add it all up, you get the total units of labor number, and it's just a straight sum. I suppose you have to, if you have to adjust for wage units, so more and less productive units of labor, and then you weight it by how far it is from the final product, n minus t, where n is the end, t is the current, the point at which it's applied, and so that weighted sum will give you the average period of production. Now you can see, I don't want to spend too much time going into all the assumptions that one has to make in order to be able to do this little exercise to come up with a single number for the entire capital stock. But you can see there are all kinds of assumptions one has to make regarding the input of labor, can you aggregate it together, and also their connections over time. The main point I want to stress here is that there is this tension in Bombarvik insofar as he wants to say that this is a structure which is inherently difficult to quantify, maybe impossible, and yet he still puts together this formula at one point in his work, which people grasped, people seized on, in order to that gave rise to a bunch of capital controversies over the years. Bombarvik is clearly the most fruitful in terms of his legacy, the most fruitful of theorists. His name is virtually synonymous with Austrian theory of capital, and different theorists today and over the years have drawn from him. For example, his work forms the basis of modern production function theory. That production function that I'll show you in a moment. Also discussions about modern growth theory, and in those implications of his work, those are drawn from a Ricardian way of looking at things. It's only the Austrians really that focus on the rest of his work, the majority of his work, which really says that doing the exercise, going through the motions of doing an exercise like producing an average period of production, tends to obscure what's really going on. So as I mentioned, the average period of production is vulnerable to all kinds of attacks. I'm just mentioning them here. The point input, point output, or flow input, flow input, point output. In other words, you have to be able to connect the inputs to the outputs in order to decide how long has that input been in the process. But if you've got a flow of inputs going along and a flow of outputs, how do you know which input is connected to which output very often? If you set it up carefully enough, you can set it up so you know which is which. But if you've got multiple inputs combining with each other, in team production, for example, it's absolutely impossible. So it's an idea that is subject technically to attack. There's a difference between looking at an idea like the average period in production and saying this thing is full of holes and you could never really calculate it, and arguing there is an intuition which says that the longer time is involved in the production of something, the more likely it is to be more productive. There's a difference between those two things. You can agree that practically speaking it's very difficult or impossible in principle to calculate such a thing, and yet also agree that there's an element of truth there, that there's something important being said. But a lot of the controversies that he was involved in this technical question. And he was attacked by John Bates Clark, and the same debate was repeated later on, a couple of generations later, when Frank Knight went after Hayek for the same kind of idea. And they attacked the technical idea of the average period of production. Clark and Knight said that time is irrelevant, basically. They said t is either 0 or it's infinite. The idea being this, just very quickly, clearly this bears more thought, but very quickly what's going on here. Imagine that you have a forest that is, you're producing lumber. Okay, so how do you get lumber? How do you get wood? You grow trees. You plant the trees, and it takes years for them to grow until they get to maturity. Then you cut them down, and then you've got your final product. Now you can think of that as a time-consuming process, and you can even calculate the average period of production. If all trees are alike, and they take the same amount of time and grow to the same height and so on, then the average period of production is exactly 1/2 of the time it takes from planting to cutting down. That can be shown. Don't have to worry about it now, but that's a nice metaphor. The point is, Clark and Knight would look at that and they'd say, but wait a minute. In a mature economy, in a market economy, these things are growing all the time. While you're cutting down the final product, you're planting new trees. So the consumption and production is simultaneous. There's no time going on. So the time period is either zero, or if you want to really be hard-nosed about it, you say, well, okay, it takes this long to plant a tree and then to cut it out. But what happened before that? You know, didn't you have to do some plans before? In that sense, if you look at a market economy, the production period is infinite. You have to go all the way back to Adam and Eve, because that's when we started to intervene in nature. So this is how they sort of nitpicked at the idea of the average period of production, and there was a lot of heat. This is going to not do what I wanted to do. Bombardics. Oh well. Let's see. A little bit of comic interlude never hurts, right? I'll have to look at it there. I'll come back to the slideshow in a minute. The Bombardics formalization allowed for the extension of the Ricardian approach into modern production function. That's very important. I needed that up there. This is a production function. Can you see it? It's a little smaller than it was. You can't see it? Good eyes. That's a production function. This Q is a function of K, L, and N, of course, the inputs. K has the form it needs always. So the idea, this is the equilibrium always idea. I don't know if you've thought much about the production function approach, but the capital always has the form that you need, and this is true both at the firm and the economy level. This approach, this production function approach, diverts attention away from the questions concerning real-world capital formation decisions. And really, it can be shown that that quantity K can be derived directly from the average period of production. If you really want to see that, you can read my book or read the article that's on the website. You see, do it there. And that's a Ricardian idea that comes directly out of Bombardic. And then there are these so-called, let's see if I can get back to this slideshow. Just indulge me a minute. Well, there it is. Now it worked. There was this debate between Cambridge, US, and Cambridge, UK, and that was at the time the protagonists thought an important debate. I don't know how many of you even heard of it. Some of you may know about it. There were all kinds of political, ideological elements associated in it. Really, the Marxist against capitalists, if you want to put it crudely. The Cambridge US sort of taking the market approach, and the Cambridge UK taking a Marxist approach. And basically the UK people said capital K is bogus. It's bogus because we can show that there's no direct relationship between the rate of interest and which they took to be the rate of profit and what's earned on that. That's just to say, as we will talk about in our next session, when the rate of interest goes down, when you accumulate capital, put it that way, when you accumulate capital, the rate of profit is supposed to diminish because of diminishing returns. But they showed that, in fact, they showed many examples where this doesn't happen, where basically as you change the production process, you can get situations where you have more capital with higher rates of return and less capital with higher rates of return, and there's a switching in between. It's not a direct relationship, and therefore they concluded, after a lot of technical discussion, which they won really, that K is bogus and therefore profits are unjustified. There's no notion in which you can identify a capital stock that is provided by capitalists which justifies the earning of capital, returning to an idea that Bombardic actually, in his discussion of Marxist economics, had tried to deal with. So all of the Ricardian notions of capital give rise to these kinds of questions. Many capital controversies. It seems in every generation there's a new capital controversy, and Bombardier to some extent fueled that process. Ludwig Lachmann argued that both the Cambridge US and the Cambridge UK people are Ricardians, in the sense that they adopt a quantification approach to capital. And in fact, the Cambridge US people opened the door. They rendered themselves vulnerable to lose this debate simply because they adopted the wrong approach to capital. And as Israel Kirzner pointed out later on, capital doesn't earn, it's not, the rate of interest is not, capital doesn't earn interest. Capital earns profit. The rate of interest, indeed, there is a direct relationship between the rate of interest and the value of capital. That's not so ambiguous, and that ambiguity does not render the earnings of capital suspect. I'll talk more about that in the next session. But so the UK Ricardians attacked the wrong thing is what it apparently all came down to. Well, here's the theory of interest that I don't have time to go into, that is related to this. And that Bombardier explains why the existence of interest is a matter of time preference. That's the other contribution that comes down to us from Bombardier. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to go into this in any of your other sessions. You have? No? Okay. This is an important idea. We would need a whole session on this by itself. But very briefly, Bombardier made the fundamental point that interest, the level of the phenomenon of interest itself, doesn't have anything to do with whether or not resources are productive. Interest is a manifestation of how we value things subjectively over time, and the idea being that the longer we have to wait for it, the more we discount its value. That's this idea of interest as a rate of discount, or looking forward, we have to pay people more as we accumulate their resources over time if they're going to do without it. It turns out that the consequences of this are enormous. In particular, it can be shown that time preference is both a necessary and a sufficient condition for the earning of interest, and gave rise to what's called the pure time preference theory of interest. That productivity cannot explain interest, although it has something to do with the level of the interest rate. It cannot explain the phenomenon of interest. And Bombardier pushed that very hard, and I think won that debate very clearly. And this emerged in modern discussions recently. I have an article on Mises and Rothbard's approach to the pure time preference theory. I think it's also on my website, and it's an interesting idea, particularly if you're interested in some of these more intricate, somewhat esoteric areas. But our purpose is more restricted here, and that is that that, as we will see, for the Austrians from Bombardier on, it's the earnings, the inputs and what they earn, the resource owners' earnings can all be classified as a form of rent. Wages is the cost of renting human beings. Capital, what you pay to capital, can be conceived as the cost of renting capital resources. Whether you rent it to yourself, in the case that you own it, or you rent it out to somebody else, what capital earns is a form of rent. And in a world of uncertainty, there will be an additional amount which we call profit. And land clearly earns rent. In that case, the earnings of all resources can be conceived as a kind of capital, and they all earn a kind of rent. This theory really goes back to an American economist, Frank Feder, and was most well developed in the Austrian school by Rothbard. But it comes also from Bombardier and the pure time preference theory. And it's important because interest then lies outside of this. The earning of interest lies outside of the earnings of the factors of production. You don't have to justify the earnings of interest by any kind of productivity. It's pure time preference. Now, there's some discussion about what time preference means. What if you have multiple interest rates? Samuelson objected, Paul Samuelson, famous Nobel Prize winner, objected to this. He introduced a Rice model into the economy and argued, well, you can show that if you have like Adam Smith's corn model, that productivity does matter. And it can be shown that in a Rice model world, productivity does seem to determine interest rates. But the point is, we then come to make a decision. How should we speak about things? In a monetary world, it would seem that time preference is the most relevant way to go. I anticipated this. Interest is not profit. Profit is the result of uncertainty. Resource owners earn rent, Rothbard and Feder. Wages are earned by human capital, rent by land and physical capital. All resources are part of capital. And this is also relevant later on to the economics of organization. So the level of interest rates has very little to do with economic growth and productivity, and it directs our attention to the market for loanable funds, which we'll talk about when we talk about business cycles. Okay, so those are the founding fathers of the Austrian school, and I have to run through very quickly now some of the later developments. Hayek is really very important in the development of capital, the next most important figure. He's clearly of the compositive school or the structural school. He's at the London School of Economics. You may have heard about the Hayek-Keynes debate. I'll talk somewhat about that later on. And he, in this debate with Keynes, needed a more complete theory of capital. So he set about in a whole series of articles trying to flesh out why it is that Keynes should have taken account of capital and didn't. And it culminates in his work on the pure theory of capital that is probably his least most read book. It's a book that he said exhausted him. I found it almost impenetrable in parts, very, very difficult to read. And he basically left the area of capital theory after that. But it's interesting what he says at one point. He says, our main concern will be to discuss the general terms, what type of equipment it will be most profitable to create under various conditions, how the equipment existing at any moment will be used, rather than explain the factors which determine the value of a given stock of productive equipment and the income that will be derived from it. That's what he says he wants to do. It's not clear that he does it in the book. And there's a long quote here that I will not read the whole of it, but he says he wants to elaborate the structure of productive equipment which man has built, and is interested in the composition of essentially different items, it's much more important than its aggregate quantity. Again, this question of structure versus quantity. So he's clearly a structuralist, if you like, and what Lachman called a part of the compositive school. It comes from the idea of the composition of the stock. Lachman was the one who Hayek left it, and Lachman picks up the next step, picks up the baton, if you like. Because Hayek never managed to produce a treatment of capital that satisfied him. He found he was exhausted by it. Lachman read this article called Capital That Raises the Demand for Capital, and that was his inspiration for his work on capital, which culminated in 1956 in Capital and Its Structure. By the time that book was published, capital theory was not really interesting to most people. Most of Lachman's work was done in the 40s in a series of articles. In 1950 he moved to South Africa, and the book only came out in 1956 and mostly was ignored. But Hayek did say at one point in his autobiographical pronouncements and in interviews that when he was asked about the theory of capital and how come he never went back to it, he said, well, as far as he could tell, Lachman had said most of what he wanted to say in Capital and Its Structure, which prompts the question, was Lachman's book on capital the final chapter, really? In some senses it seems as it was. It seems like it was. And some of the aspects of Lachman's work very quickly. Capital is heterogeneous. He finally makes that very, very clear and spends a lot of time on the diversity distinctive items in the capital stock, in the capital structure, capital versus capital goods. He says capital goods are part of the capital structure. A structure is an order. You know, Hayek was big on this notion of order, on how things are related to each other in an order, in an extended order. The capital structure is partly designed and partly the result of adaptation, what we might call spontaneous order. The design part is about firms or households putting together these disparate items for a productive plan. The spontaneous part is about the market process. Some plans are going to be rewarded with profits, some are not. People, according to Lachman, very important idea, people have different perceptions of the state of affairs and what they can lead to. That is to say, people have different expectations. All results have to be interpreted subjectively. A group of people appraising a particular productive project will come up with different assessments of the value of that project. If you have a bunch of people with different assessments, how many of them can be right? If you have 10 people with different expectations of something, how many of them can be right? Maximum. 1, right? Which means that 9 of them are going to make errors. So any productive process, any market process, that ignores the role of errors is leaving out most of the story. That's the market process. It weeds out the errors or adapts the errors, if you like. The capital structure is characterized by what he called complementarity and specificity. Complementarity is about the order, bringing it together. Things work together to enhance their joint productivity. Substitutability is about when things don't turn out as we expected, those errors, then we make substitutions. He gives the example of a firm that has a bunch of delivery trucks, and they have delivery areas that they're delivering to, a particular product or whatever, the distribution. Now, conceived of from the point of view of a plan that is working, those delivery trucks are in complementary relationship to one another, right? They enhance the joint productivity of the organization. But if something goes wrong, one of the trucks breaks down. Coming in from the airport yesterday, Fee kindly sent a car to pick us up. I came in with my family, and I thought that was very nice. About 15 minutes out of the airport, the car broke down, just died. Pull over to the side of the road. They had to divert a car from Manhattan to come and get us. That was an illustration of what I'm talking about. This is a transportation company in which the various components work together to enhance the joint productivity. But when something goes wrong, you have to make substitutions. Then the individual cars are substitutes for one another. This is a little different from the notion in neoclassical economics, where something is either a substitute or a complement to various degrees, and always. So these are important concepts in capital theory that come out of Lachman. Decision makers form capital combinations with complementary resources. Some are dynamically more specific than others. What does that mean? It means when things change, when there's an unexpected event, you can adapt by changing the purposes for which those things were intended. An opera house can be turned into a movie theater quite easily, but you can't eat a machine. You know, some things are more specific than others, and dynamically so, and that's important. Changes cause substitutions to be made. There are capital gains and losses that are associated with that specificity. The more specific something, the more the capital loss is going to be from any change. Specifically, specialized resources carry risk. They're vulnerable to unexpected events. Nevertheless, Blum-Bavrek's idea is valid. Why do I say nevertheless? Because you can't aggregate the capital stock. But the idea that Blum-Bavrek had, that if you extend the time involved in the capital structure, you will increase productivity. Lachman says this is a valid idea. The capital structure becomes increasingly more complex over time. This is an idea, he was ahead of his time here, and Hayek too, in the notion of complexity. The idea of adaptively complex structures. So what about it? Where is this relevant? Why do we talk about all of this? Although I think that you can see from some of the ideas that I threw out rather rapidly a moment ago that these things obviously are relevant to appraising the world that we now live in. I contend, and I fleshed this out in the article that I mentioned to you earlier, that capital and how we conceive of capital really has a lot to do with the scope of economics. The question of structure versus stock, of quantity versus quality, of composition versus size, either limits or expands the scope of economics. For example, what about the black box of the firm? This idea, in most of the time that I've learned economics, although this has changed in the last 10 to 15 years, but when I certainly came of age as an economist, nobody said anything about what goes on inside the firm. There was one book by Burl and Means talking about the separation of ownership and control, But mostly you wrote down these production functions, you got an output, there was the inputs, and there was no, it just happened, it was a function. Where's the firm? It's there, it's that black box. Things go in and things come out. If you expand the idea of the notion of capital, you're forced to go into that and talk about specific resources, complementary resources, who has the knowledge, how is it organized. And of course we see this in a lot of modern work, not only in Austrian economics, but in the work of Jensen and Meckling, for example, in finance. We see it in a lot of the work on the theory of the firm, or resource-based theories of the firm, and strategy literature, which I've become very interested in. Those of you who are interested in managerial economics, is now become an area into which I think that Austrian economics, using capital-based ideas can contribute. And here there's work by a fellow called Richardson. In 1960 wrote a book called Information and Investment. Edith Penrose, who worked with Fritz Machlip on theory of the growth of the firm, and recent work on firm boundaries and strategies linking up with the literature of Coase and Williamson, theory of the firm, and Oliver Williamson in his work on mechanisms of governance and so on, the economic institutions of capital. Questions like, when does aggregation, quantity approach, obscure structure? When can incommensurate, the answer is that when incommensurate items are aggregated. It's not that aggregation itself is illegitimate or lacks usefulness. It is that inappropriate aggregation does. So when is it appropriate? It's appropriate when you aggregate commensurable things, when you form structures in such a way that you can aggregate elements within them and then relate those elements to one another. And the idea of modularity comes up here. The idea that you can aggregate certain homogeneous or constantly situated modules. Don't have too much time to go into this, but you can see that it's pregnant with implications. For a simple example, the theory of perfect competition. The theory of perfect competition suggests that you can aggregate these different firms who are all identical. You have to assume that they're identical in order to be able to aggregate them. Well, what if they're not identical? Then you get into the theory of firm organization. Now you have to sort of go down to a more micro level, more microscopic level if you like, and to look at the internal structure. But within the firm there are obviously structures that need to be aggregated. So I think I'm running out of time here. Organization matters for production, which is an important idea that is not found in neoclassical economics. If organization matters, then organization sort of is an input into production. It matters how somebody's making a decision. You work there, we put this machine there, we locate here. Those are the very notions themselves lead to value if they're employed properly. And we get a wider and more fruitful perspective if we adopt that approach. So that's what I have to say about capital, and I believe we have a 15-minute break before we reconvene. Thank you. I'll stick around here in case there are any questions.